And these are young people who may have known since they were 2 years old exactly who they are, who suffered for 6-7 years before they had any relief.
I knew the alphabet activists were crazy, but I didn't know it was this bad. We're going to break down the huge Supreme Court case over the medical transitioning of minors and so much more on today's episode of the Brad vs. Everyone podcast, my daily show where I take on the craziest ideas from across the internet, across our politics, and across the media, all from an independent perspective. Today, Wednesday, the Supreme Court is hearing arguments in a case called Tennessee versus Scrimeti. This case is about whether Tennessee is allowed to ban the medical transitioning of minors as far as puberty blockers and hormone treatments are concerned. The case is not about surgeries, with the ACLU and the Biden administration arguing against the ban, arguing that it is unconstitutional discrimination. To get a sense of this case and the arguments that the LGBT activists and their allies are making, we're going to break down an interview with the ACLU's lead attorney, Chase Strangio, over on CNN that was absolutely wild to watch. Here's the first bit of that.
I want to bring in the lawyer who's going to argue this high-profile case before the U.S. Supreme Court, Chase Strangio. Chase, thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate it. So the case comes at a time when 26 states have passed laws restricting healthcare treatments for transgender youth, according to a CNN analysis of data from the nonprofit think tank Movement Advancement Project. So how do you plan to argue before the U.S. Supreme Court in a case that could have wide-ranging implications beyond the state of Tennessee?
Well, thank you for having me, Jake. And obviously, this is a critical inflection point for transgender people across the country. We're coming off of an election season where transgender people played an outside role in people's consciousness in terms of the way in which we were situated as a threat to others. And when we look at the map of states that ban this type of evidence-based healthcare, we went from 0 states that had these bans in 2020 to now more than half the country.
So I just want to pause here for a second and flag one thing. When we're talking about giving gender-confused youth puberty blockers or hormones, that is not evidence-based healthcare. It's a radical treatment being given with very little high-quality data or long-term research. And you don't have to take my word for it. That was the finding of the comprehensive and esteemed Cass review over in the UK by Dr. Hilary Cass. She examined the evidence base behind giving gender-confused minors puberty blockers, which block the development of their natal sex puberty, and she found it to be incredibly weak and limited. She also flagged many potential serious health consequences from puberty blockers, including decreased bone density, limited height growth, and even some issues with brain development and other things as potential concerns that need to be further investigated. Cass also confirmed that putting kids on puberty blockers makes whatever gender dysphoria they have unlikely to abate, because going through the puberty of your birth sex is when that is often resolved, or at least it used to be before they started doing this, and many of those kids just grew up to be gay or lesbian. Some did end up still identifying as transgender later in life, for whom maybe it is appropriate, in my view, for them to take hormones or have different treatments or surgeries as adults. But when you give kids as young as 10, 11, or 12 puberty blockers, you pause that chance that they will simply become comfortable with their birth sex, and you put them on this almost inevitable path towards irreversible medicalization. If they go down the full route of puberty blockers, blocking puberty, and then cross-sex hormones, that can cause lifelong issues with sexual functioning and even infertility. And it's all being done with very, very little high-quality evidence behind it or supporting the claims that activists often make about this healthcare, where they frame it as proven and safe and life-saving when there's no proof of any such thing. Now, this interview and this case gets way more unhinged and crazy real quick. But first, a brief message from today's sponsor. Guys, I recently recommitted to a new health and fitness routine. Can you tell? And I'm doing that with the help of today's sponsor, Lumen, which is helping me increase my energy levels, feel better in my body, and gain muscle. Lumen is the world's first handheld metabolic coach. It's a cool and easy to use device that measures your metabolism through your breath. And on the app, it lets you know if you're burning fat or carbs, and gives you tailored advice to improve your workouts, nutrition, stress management, and even your sleep. Because your metabolism is at the center of everything your body does, optimal metabolic health translates to a bunch of benefits, including easier weight management, improved energy levels, better fitness results, and better sleep. Lumen doesn't just help you measure your metabolic health, it also gives you meal suggestions and other ideas to improve it. So if you want to take the next step in improving your health or get a great gift for the health-conscious person in your life, go to lumen.me/Brad for 15% off your Lumen. That is LUMEN.me/Brad for 15% off your purchase, also available at the link in the description or in the pinned comment. And now, back to the show. And just to give you a sense of who Chase Strangio is, the kind of very radical transgender activist here who represents the ACLU in this case, I want to read you one of Chase's most infamous tweets. Women and girls who are trans are biological women and girls. What? I'm sorry, but I've always supported the rights of trans adults to live their best lives. I've always been willing to call them what they'd like to be called, but you're never going to convince people that trans women are literally biologically women, because they're not, and that's kind of the whole point of them being trans, which again, I don't really have a problem with, but that just gives you some context about who this person is and where they're coming from. Now let's hear some more of this interview where Chase gets into the main legal argument the ACLU is making in this case.
So before the court tomorrow, the question is really a simple one as I see it. It's really, this is a law that bans medical treatment only when it is prescribed inconsistent with an individual's sex. Our argument is that that treats people differently because of their sex, and therefore the court has to treat it like all other forms of sex discrimination, and that's why it's unconstitutional.
So let me just explain this legal argument for you so you can understand it. Then I'll give you my take on it. What Chase and the ACLU are arguing is that because these laws say that something like puberty blockers cannot be prescribed to trans kids, as they would call them, but can be prescribed in other situations, like when you have early onset puberty, hitting a child when they're 6 or 7, doctors will give them puberty blockers so it doesn't happen for a few more years until it's developmentally appropriate. And there are other medical situations where hormone therapy might be prescribed to treat a medical issue. What they're arguing is that this is discriminatory because in certain cases, they can be given these treatments in non-transgender cases, but in transgender cases with transgender identifying patients, it's being prohibited. They say that therefore you're discriminating against people on the basis of their biological sex, because if this person was one sex, they could get the treatment, but if they're the opposite sex and identifying as the other sex, aka transgender, then they can't get the treatment. They're calling that unconstitutional discrimination because federal law does say that you're not allowed to discriminate on the basis of sex. Now, there are many problems with this argument that I can see, one of which is that many of these same trans activists, Chase Strangio included, have basically argued that trans people are their identified sex, not their birth sex. But this argument kind of rests on the fact that trans people are still the sex they were born as, which I do agree with. They just have gender dysphoria, which causes them to want to live life as if they are the other sex. However, it doesn't follow for me then that banning these treatments for minors constitutes sex discrimination. First and foremost, because treating people differently on the basis of sex is allowed. It doesn't inherently constitute unlawful discrimination. That's why we have female prisons and male prisons and all sorts of rules and regulations and laws that treat people in different sexes differently. So you do have to prove more than just the sexes are being treated differently to find something to be unlawful, unconstitutional sex discrimination. And I think the real thing that's happening here is not that these treatments are being banned or allowed on a discriminatory basis based on the identity of the participant or the patient, but that they're being banned for some purposes and allowed for other purposes. As the super insightful website SCOTUS blog reports, Tennessee counters that the law in this case simply regulates the practice of medicine in two different ways. First, it says it draws a line between adults and minors, something that is not uncommon in medicine or the law. Second, it draws a line based on the purpose for which medical procedures are being used. It prohibits the use of puberty blockers and hormone treatment for gender-affirming care, but it allows them to be used for other purposes, such as precocious puberty and congenital defects. That's something that happens all the time. A medication is allowed for one purpose and not allowed for another purpose. And I find the argument convincing that what's happening in this case is treatments are being prohibited for one purpose but allowed for other purposes that are meaningfully different in kind than transitioning someone's sex or blocking their puberty forever of their birth sex. But that is the complicated legal argument at stake in this case that I do acknowledge I'm not a constitutional lawyer and can't offer ultimate insight into. Here, though, is the moment in this interview where Chase Strangio comes unhinged, in my view, and really reveals how radical the activist class is on this and how extreme the position they're arguing actually is. Take a listen.
What do you say to physicians who are sensitive and supportive of trans kids, obviously don't want suicidal ideation, etc., but wonder if there is enough data as of now to prove that it is beneficial to allow these sort of treatments before the age of 18?
So I would say three things. And the first is we have decades of both clinical experience and research data showing that this is medical treatment that provides critical benefits to adolescents who need it. And so this is not new. This is not new medication. And so we have that information. We have long-term studies that track people for 5-6 years. The Supreme Court this week heard arguments in an FDA case in which the FDA referred to long-term as being 6 months of follow-up. Here we have years of follow-up. And so that's the first thing. And then the second thing I would say is nobody has to provide this medication to adolescents. These are not doctors being forced to provide this medication. These are doctors who are wanting to treat their patients in the best way that they know how based on the best available evidence to us. And these are young people who may have known since they were 2 years old exactly who they are, who suffered for 6-7 years before they had any relief. And
excuse me? Y'all caught that, right? This ACLU activist, queer attorney just said that 2-year-olds can know who they are and know what gender identity they have. Yeah, no. 2-year-olds are delulu. They routinely think they might be animals or have very loose attachments with reality, and I'm not sure how anyone who's ever spent time with young children could think otherwise, or could remotely suggest that kids so young as 2 or even 10, 11 actually have a concrete sense of self and understanding of concepts like sex or sexual orientation or gender identity that could ever justify making potentially irreversible changes to their body through irreversible medical transitions in many cases. I've always supported the rights of legal adults to access these treatments if they so choose, but I've never thought it made sense to allow kids to make these decisions at ages where they're far too young to truly consent or understand the lifelong ramifications of the things they're doing to their bodies, which again can often cause lifelong sexual functioning issues and lifelong infertility challenges. That's not okay. That shouldn't be done to kids too young to understand what they're really signing up for. And the fact that the most credible, most serious activists arguing this before the Supreme Court hold the delusional belief that 2-year-olds understand their own self-gender identity completely, to me, really shows how extreme and out of touch the activist class is on this issue. Now, there's one more bit from this interview that I want to play for you that I think is where Chase or the ACLU have their strongest case. Take a listen.
It's not the kids who are consenting to this treatment, it's the parents who are consenting to the treatment. And as a parent, I would say when our children are suffering, we are suffering. And these are parents who love their children, who are listening to the advice of their doctors, of the mainstream medical community, and doing what's right for their kids, and the state of Tennessee has displaced their judgment.
So while I don't ultimately agree with this, I've always thought this was the strongest argument that those who oppose banning the medical transition of minors have in their toolkit. That this is between parents and their doctors, and we shouldn't have the government micromanaging their decisions, and that parents have their kids' best interest at heart and are just going to do what's best for their child. I do have sympathy for that argument, and I think in most cases I would be persuaded by that line of thought, but ultimately not in this one. For one thing, the parents in these cases have been woefully misled by activists masquerading as medical professionals who've told them things that are not justified by the data and the evidence, like if you don't transition your child, they'll probably kill themselves, even though there is not good evidence proving that these treatments lower suicidality or improve mental health. So parents are being lied to and manipulated. They're not making free, fully informed, consensual decisions in their child's best interest. And two, everyone, even the most pro-parental autonomy person, does acknowledge that there are some limits to what parents can do with their kids. And I think we would all agree that even if parents think it's what's best for their kids, and even if there's a doctor willing somewhere to provide it, they shouldn't be allowed to get their child a lobotomy or chop off one of their kids' legs because they say they identify as an amputee. Obviously, I'm not saying that trans people or trans kids are the same as those situations. I'm simply saying everyone agrees there has to be a line somewhere. So the only question is, which side of the line do these treatments fall on? And for me, because they are so routinely irreversible and have life-altering consequences, and because they are so unproven and unsupported, they shouldn't be allowed to do this to minors. Parents of those minors should wait and see, and if their child grows up and is 17, 18, 19 and still has this persistent gender dysphoria, maybe medical transition might be right for them. But putting young children on a medical pathway that's often irreversible and has lifelong ramifications is not going to age well, and I think will be remembered as a dark period in American medicine. Anyway, that's my take on this case and the arguments coming out of the LGBTQIA plus Wi-Fi password community, which, by the way, I don't appreciate my identity as a gay man being lumped in with this. This doesn't really have anything to do with me. You can be fully supportive of gay marriage, gay rights, gay people living their lives, and not support the medical transitioning of minors. And the conflation of this all under one umbrella, I think, is part of what's leading to backsliding in support for gay rights. Anyway, let me know what you think of all of this in the comments below, and do make sure you hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed while you're at it. Remember, I do read the comments and I pick a few to respond to in every episode. Plus, if you leave your comment with a super chat or a super thanks, I'll definitely respond to it on tomorrow's show. And now it's time for Brad versus TikTok, my daily segment where I take on the craziest ideas from the Clock app.
Pronoun of the day is slugs.
Today, this woke TikToker's take on Wicked is kinda unhinged.
You cannot be a Donald Trump fan and a Wicked fan. In fact, I think if you voted for Donald Trump in 2024, you shouldn't even be allowed to see it in theaters, and you shouldn't be allowed to see any of the stage shows around the world.
Oh? So now we're advocating for political segregation and banning certain groups of people from accessing certain spaces or participating in certain walks of life. Babe, you might have missed the message of Wicked a little bit there.
So the actual conflict in Wicked is not about Elphaba being a witch, and it's not that she's green. The actual conflict is that the government of Oz is taking away rights from animals who previously had rights to do things like speak and have jobs. And Elphaba learns about this through one of her professors, who's a goat, and he starts hearing stories from other friends who are losing their ability and their right to speak. Now, Elphaba, like most people in Oz, has believed the propaganda that the wizard is good and he wants to help people and he cares, until she meets the wizard, realizes that he's a con man turned wannabe dictator. Sound familiar? He is the one taking rights away from animals, and he wants her to use her powers for bad because she is a witch and she is quite powerful. Elphaba becomes an activist. She's in opposition to the wizard. Okay, she's setting animals free. She's trying to save more animals. That is why she's labeled as wicked. The wizard essentially runs this big PR campaign to call her wicked so that people think that she is the evil one, when in reality, it's the wizard all along, because propaganda works. It's also really easy for him to convince the people of Oz that she's wicked because of the color of her skin. Imagine a world where a con man convinces people he cares about them and then slowly takes rights away from groups that previously had those rights. Pretty hard to believe.
Okay, there's so much to unpack here. First and foremost, I do agree, and I just saw the movie last night, and I actually did like it, that the movie Wicked, and I've seen the musical as well before it, has a political message. And that political message is one about the perils and dangers of authoritarianism and discrimination. But if you believe that message maps on to Trump, and I don't, which I'll get into, but if you believe that it does and that Trump is the new Hitler or whatever, shouldn't you want Trump supporters to see it and hopefully absorb the message and see the error of their ways? If you were actually trying to make the world a better place or have a positive impact, and if you actually had genuine concern about these issues rather than virtue signaling and TikTok trolling for clout, you would want Trump supporters to be exposed to that message and hopefully change their minds. You wouldn't be advocating for banning them from the theater. And I'm sorry, but if you think these warnings can only be applied to Trump and not the Democrats, you're delusional. The Biden-Harris administration literally tried to launch an Orwellian-sounding disinformation governance board and was exposed for extensively pressuring the social media companies to take down Americans' speech. When it comes to censoring people, the Democrats have done plenty of that. And as far as taking away people's jobs, am I the only one old enough to remember when the Biden-Harris administration pushed a vaccine mandate that forced many people out of their jobs? And it's kind of bizarre to talk about a situation where the political leader controls all the media and kind of has this propaganda network and compare that to a Republican president, because while Trump does have his sycophantic right-wing media, he also has the whole mainstream media against him. So when he was president, they were constantly doing the opposite of promoting his message. Whereas the Biden administration had the mainstream media kind of in lockstep, and so they would really parrot his narratives, like all the silly ones, like inflation is transitory, there is no border crisis, nothing to see here, until it got so bad they had to admit it eventually. But if one of the two has more of a propagandistic grip on the media, it's Biden and the Democrats. Though even them, it's still a free press. It's not like a government-controlled media like they have in Wicked. So it's not super applicable in either direction, but it's definitely not the case with Trump, where you have an incredibly oppositional media. And to some extent, I do think that's a good thing. Now, none of this is saying that Trump doesn't have any authoritarian tendencies. I think he does, or that there's nothing in the movie that could serve as some sort of comparison or warning to things about Trump. I do think Trump scapegoats groups of people sometimes, or just groups, like the animals are scapegoated in Wicked. You can see this with the way that he talks about immigration, sometimes collectivizing or talking about all or most immigrants as if they're the problem, rather than just the ones who do come and commit crimes and are a bad influence and should be deported. He often casts with far too broad a brush when it comes to his rhetoric about immigration and immigrants. But Biden and Democrats all the time categorize and scapegoat groups of people, whether it's them blaming the unvaccinated for the continuation of the pandemic, casting all Trump supporters as evil, racist bigots, or even like blaming Facebook for killing people during the pandemic. All politicians and political sides do scapegoating. It's just a thing, and it's not a uniquely partisan phenomenon. So this lady's whole take on Wicked makes very little sense to me and just comes off as hyper-partisan and tribalistic and, frankly, kind of unhinged. But of course, the comment section just ate this up uncritically. One person wrote, "I cried during Defying Gravity because of the election. 100% agree with you." You should probably be a little bit embarrassed about that and the lack of mental resilience that it demonstrates, not proudly boasting about it on TikTok, babe. Another person says, even deeper, it's about the conflict between what we call good and evil, or masculine, light versus feminine, dark, which also played out in the election. This is all very deep stuff. Yeah, you're going to need to put down the crack pipe, babe, because you've had enough. You're reading in a little too deep into that one. It's not about masculine versus feminine. That is not a theme in Wicked. The two main characters who represent the two different paths and approaches are both females and feminine. Also, these takes are so wild, coming from the crowd that doesn't think gender is real or exists. Another person wrote, "Going on the 5th with my family. My sister is a trumpeter. It's going to be an awkward lunch after." I mean, it really doesn't need to be unless you make it so by being obnoxious or annoying about it. Like, you should just be able to enjoy a musical movie and talk about it with your family without injecting politics into it. And if you can't, the problem might be you. All in all, I liked the Wicked movie. I thought it was pretty good. I didn't think it was like the best thing I've ever seen. But I find the woke hysteria around it, from the TikTok discourse to the cringe-inducing interviews with Ariana Grande and Cynthia Erivo, to the stupid trigger warning that was attached to it and so much more, actually frustrating on multiple levels, not just because I disagree with it on the merits, but also because it's like distracting from and discrediting from what was not a super woke movie and was, I thought, a pretty good movie and a pretty good piece of art. It's like they're doing their own cause, their beloved Wicked, a disservice by attaching all this nonsense to it and politicizing it far beyond the broad political themes that are actually appropriate and incorporated into the work, and just making it a partisan, tribalistic thing when it's not actually that. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. And now I'll wrap up today's show by reading a few of your comments from yesterday's episode. So one person writes about the salon owner who went viral on TikTok for saying Trump supporters weren't welcome in her safe space and saying that she's applying to Chipotle instead because her clients are abandoning her. It's almost like that wasn't a good idea to try out in northern Idaho. One person writes, so instead of running her salon with Trump supporters as customers, she's going to be working at Chipotle serving Trump supporters food. LOL, this woman is a genius. Yeah, that's actually such a good point. I wish I'd thought of that when I was filming yesterday, because like she doesn't want to work with Trump supporters, so she's nuking her 22-year salon career as a hairdresser so she can go work at Chipotle or something, where you're literally going to be required to serve Trump supporters. If someone comes in with a Trump hat on and you refuse to serve them, the most likely outcome there, especially in northern freaking Idaho, is you getting a pink slip, babe. So the whole thing is stupid on another level I didn't even realize yesterday. Another person writes, at this point, I automatically think anyone saying America in general is a racist, sexist, homophobic place is just projecting. To me, it's more a sign that they've kind of just internalized a lot of propaganda and lack nuance in the way they view the world, because blindly painting a whole country in these black and white stripes is never really going to accurately capture the spirit and nature of such a complicated and multifaceted society like the one we live in. Another person writes, I'm a conservative, but I would not go to a business that said they did not allow Kamala or Biden supporters. We are all Americans, and that needs to come first. I completely agree, and I would do the same. And I think we all have to have this approach to stop that kind of hyper-partisan world from becoming a reality. Another person says, the be kind people are often simmering rage and hate-filled. You know, that's a good point I hadn't quite thought about. Like, anytime I see like be kind in a TikTok video, that same video usually includes some incredibly unkind sentiments. But hey, what am I noticing here? Just a pattern, I guess. Another person writes, I think the country is getting a great life lesson in how sometimes publicly exercising your First Amendment rights gives the rest of society the choice to also not spend their money in your business. Yeah, I do completely agree with this. I think there's a version of this that becomes cancel culture that I don't necessarily support. But if you literally say Trump people aren't welcome at my business, and then Trump people stop coming to your business, you can't cry cancel culture. You played yourself. Another person says, your intro is perfection, Brad, just the right length that I don't feel the need to try and skip it. Reminds me of the intro to Frasier, the only sitcom that ever just got right to the point without a long intro no one cares about. Keep up the good work, and best to you and your man. Love you. Well, thank you so much. And actually, when I had it done, I asked my guy to make it super short, because I know I wanted an intro. I wanted to flash some cool moments from my career, but I know people hate really long YouTuber intros and either skip them or click out. So I specifically tried to avoid that. So I'm glad it worked. Another person says, it looks like this woman also closed her TikTok account. My question for all these folks that are harping about the lawfare result and Trump's past sexual escapades, have you ever heard of Bill Clinton? In my opinion, Trump is not an angel, but if I were to compare, I think what he was accused of was comparable and actually more mild than Clinton's issue. I think Clinton has been accused of some pretty bad things, including actually very serious and credible rape allegations. I don't know if I would say it's worse than the things Trump has been accused of, because he's been accused of a lot as well. But I do agree that it is hypocritical for Democrats who supported Bill to be very concerned and upset about Trump's issues and accusations. Anyway, this comment concludes, I swear my kitten is in love with you. She watches you so closely and paws the monitor when you're close up on it. Oh, that is so cute and sweet. I think kittens are so adorable. Unfortunately, I am allergic to cats, so I don't think I'll ever be able to get one. All right, everybody, that's it for this episode of the Brad vs. Everyone podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please do make sure you're subscribed if you aren't yet, and do hit that like button before you go. And remember to comment with your thoughts. I do take the time to read the comments, and I pick a few to respond to in every episode. Plus, if you leave your comment with a super chat or a super thanks, I'll definitely respond to it on tomorrow's show. And with that, we'll talk again tomorrow.